Let me tell you about the night that destroyed everything I thought I knew about love, about truth, and about the people we trust with our hearts. It's a story that still keeps me awake at night. 10 years later, wondering if I could have changed anything, if I could have saved him, saved her, saved all of us from what was coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began, on a perfect spring evening in 2014, when the whole world still made sense. You have to understand what Ethan Crawford meant to our town. In a place like Millfield, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival, Ethan was our shining star, the proof that good things could happen to good people, that dreams really could come true if you just worked hard enough and stayed true to yourself. I was 15 then, just a sophomore watching from the bleachers as the seniors lived out their fairy tale moments. But even from my awkward teenage perspective, I could see that Ethan was different. He wasn't just handsome, though God. He was beautiful in that all-American way that made grown women sigh and teenage girls write his name in their notebooks. No. What made Ethan special was how he carried himself, like he understood that his gifts came with responsibility. He'd stop to help elderly Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries. He'd spend his lunch periods tutoring struggling freshmen in math. When Tommy Morrison, a kid everyone else picked on for his stutter, got cornered by bullies behind the gymnasium, it was Ethan who showed up and somehow convinced them to walk away without throwing a single punch. That was his gift. He could diffuse any situation, make anyone feel like they mattered. And then there was Sarah. Sarah Martinez was the kind of beautiful that made you believe in poetry. Dark hair that caught the light like silk, eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could stop traffic on Main Street. But what made her perfect for Ethan wasn't just her beauty. It was the way she grounded him, the way she could make him laugh when the pressure of being everyone's golden boy got too heavy. They'd been together since sophomore year, and watching them was like watching a movie about young love. The way Ethan would wait by her locker every morning with coffee from Murphy's Diner. How Sarah would be in the front row at every football game, wearing his jersey like a badge of honor. The way they'd hold hands walking down the hallway, completely lost in their own little world. Prom night 2014 was supposed to be their coronation. Everyone knew they'd be crowned king and queen. It was as inevitable as sunrise. I remember watching them dance to At Last by Etta James. Ethan, in his perfectly fitted black tuxedo, Sarah glowing in silver silk that made her look like she'd stepped out of a dream. They moved together like they'd been dancing their whole lives, like they were the only two people in the world. "They're going to get married," my friend Jessica whispered beside me. "Can you imagine? They'll have the most beautiful babies." I nodded, caught up in the romance of it all. At 15, I still believed in forever. I still thought that love was enough to overcome anything. If I'd known what was coming, I would have memorized that moment. The way the light caught Ethan's hair, the expression of pure joy on Sarah's face, the way the whole gymnasium seemed to sparkle around them, like we were all living inside a snow globe. Because 12 hours later, Ethan Crawford vanished from the face of the earth. I'll never forget the phone call that changed everything. It was 6:47 a.m. on Sunday morning. I remember because I was staring at my alarm clock, trying to decide if I could sleep for another hour before I had to get ready for church. The phone rang, and I heard my mother's voice downstairs, concern creeping into her tone. What do you mean he's missing? I crept to the top of the stairs, my heart already racing for reasons I couldn't name. Since when? Have you called the police? Mom's voice was getting higher, more frantic. Oh my God! Margaret! Oh my God! Margaret Crawford, Ethan's mother, and I threw on clothes and raced downstairs. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her bathrobe, the phone pressed to her ear like a lifeline. We'll be right over, she was saying. Don't worry about anything else. We'll help you search. Mom? I said when she hung up. What's wrong? She looked at me with eyes that were already filling with tears. Ethan never came home last night. His car is missing. Margaret and David are. They're scared something terrible has happened. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. It seemed like the entire town mobilized to search for their golden boy. Search parties formed spontaneously. People drove every back road, checked every ditch, called every friend who might have seen him after prom. Sarah was the one who found his car. She'd been driving the route from the school to his house over and over, retracing the path he should have taken, when she spotted the glint of metal in Miller's Creek. Ethan's silver Honda Accord was nose down in the shallow water, driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. I'll never forget the sound Sarah made when she called 911. I was with the search party that responded to the call, and when we got there, she was standing waist-deep in the creek, her prom dress from the night before soaked and clinging to her legs, her makeup running in dark streams down her face. He's not here, she kept saying, her voice hollow with shock. He's not here. Where is he? Where is he? The police tried to get her to come out of the water, but she just stood there, staring at the empty car like she could will Ethan to materialize in the driver's seat. It took her best friend, Ashley, and Ashley's dad to finally get her onto dry land. That's when we saw the blood. Not a lot. Just a few drops on the steering wheel, a smear on the door handle. But enough to paint a picture that none of us wanted to see. Enough to transform a missing person case into something much darker. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Millfield had ever seen. FBI agents descended on our quiet town like an occupying army, turning over every stone, questioning every resident, treating all of us like potential suspects in the disappearance of our golden boy. They interviewed Sarah for 8 hours straight. I heard from Ashley that they kept asking her the same questions over and over. Had she and Ethan fought? Was he seeing someone else? Did she know about any enemies he might have had? Enemies? Sarah had laughed bitterly. According to Ashley, Ethan didn't have enemies. Everyone loved Ethan. That's the problem. Everyone loved him, and now he's gone. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, painfully, Millfield began to accept that their golden boy might never come home. The search parties dwindled. The media attention moved on to other tragedies. Cece's life, inexorably, continued. But the Crawford family never stopped believing. David Crawford, a big, gentle man who ran the local hardware store, became obsessed with finding his son. He spent every free moment driving back roads, following up on tips, chasing shadows. He hired private investigators with money the family didn't have. He mortgaged the house, cashed in his retirement, sold everything of value they owned. Margaret tried to hold things together, but you could see her breaking a little more each day. She stopped coming to church, stopped leaving the house except for necessities. When I'd see her at the grocery store, she looked like a ghost of herself, thin, pale, moving through the world like she was underwater. And Sarah became someone else entirely. The vibrant, laughing girl who danced with Ethan at prom disappeared as completely as he had. In her place was a quiet, serious young woman who threw herself into her studies with an intensity that worried everyone who knew her. She graduated valedictorian, an honor that should have been Ethan's, and accepted a full scholarship to State University. The day she left for college, I watched from my bedroom window as she loaded her car with the careful efficiency of someone who just wanted to escape. Before she drove away, she stood for a long moment looking at the Crawford house across the street. Then she got in her car and left Millfield behind, just like she'd left everything else from her old life. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought Sarah Martinez and Ethan Crawford had become just another small-town tragedy. The kind of story that people would tell in hushed voices for a generation before it faded into local legend. I was wrong. 10 years later, I was 35 and had somehow become the senior reporter for the Millfield Gazette, a position that sounds more impressive than it actually is in a town of 8,000 people. I covered city council meetings, high school football games, and the occasional human interest story about someone's prize-winning tomatoes. It wasn't the career in investigative journalism I'd dreamed of, but it was steady work, and it kept me in the town where all my roots were planted. Besides, after what happened with Ethan, I'd lost some of my appetite for digging too deep into other people's secrets. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. I was at Murphy's Diner, working on my third cup of coffee and trying to make the upcoming town budget meeting sound interesting enough to hold readers' attention past the headline. Murphy had kept the place exactly the same as it had been 10 years earlier. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, the same Coca-Cola signs on the walls that had been there since the 1950s. The breakfast crowd was its usual mix of retirees, shift workers, and people like me who used caffeine as a food group. Henderson was in her regular booth, reading the obituaries first as always. Bob Martinez, Sarah's uncle, was at the counter, arguing politics with Murphy like they did every morning. I was deep in my notes when the bell above the door chimed. Nothing unusual about that. The bell rang every few minutes as people came and went, but something made me look up. Maybe it was the way the conversation at the counter stopped mid-sentence. Maybe it was the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Henderson. Maybe it was just instinct. A man stood in the doorway, and my first thought was that he looked lost. Not just geographically lost, but lost in the deeper sense, like he wasn't sure what world he'd stepped into or whether he belonged there. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested hard living rather than athleticism. His dark blonde hair was longer than was fashionable, unkempt like he'd been sleeping rough. His clothes were clean but worn, jeans with frayed cuffs, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, work boots that had walked a lot of miles. But it was his face that made my coffee cup slip from my suddenly nerveless fingers. Even with the new lines around his eyes, even with the hollow cast to his cheeks, even with the angry red scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw like someone had tried to erase part of him, I knew that face. We all did. Jesus Christ. Bob Martinez whispered from the counter, and the name hung in the air like a prayer or a curse. Because standing in the doorway of Murphy's diner, looking exactly like a ghost made flesh, was Ethan Crawford. He seemed to realize that every eye in the place was on him, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or fear. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the scar on his face, a gesture that spoke of habit, of a wound that had been touched and worried over many times. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was different, rougher, more hesitant than I remembered. "I think I might be lost. I'm looking for someone who might know me. I think I used to live here." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the coffee pot bubbling, Mrs. Henderson's shaky breathing. But nobody spoke, and nobody moved. We were all too busy trying to process the impossible. Finally, Murphy himself came out from behind the counter. Murphy was in his 70s now, had been running this diner since before most of us were born. He'd known Ethan since he was 5 years old, had given him his first job washing dishes when he turned 14. "Son," Murphy said gently, his voice thick with emotion, "what's your name?" Ethan, because what else could we call him, looked confused by the question. I think it might be Ethan. Someone told me that once. But I don't." He paused, his hand going to his scar again. "I don't remember. I don't remember anything." That's when Sarah walked in. She'd been coming to Murphy's every Tuesday for 3 years, ever since she'd moved back to Millfield to teach at the elementary school. It was part of her routine, coffee and a blueberry muffin before school. Sitting in the same booth where she and Ethan used to share breakfast on Saturday mornings when they were teenagers. She pushed through the door the same way she always did, already reaching for her phone to check messages, completely unaware that her entire world was about to tilt off its axis. When she looked up and saw him, the phone slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Sarah took one stumbling step forward, then another, like she was walking through deep water. "Ethan," she whispered, and the name was so full of pain and hope and disbelief that it made my chest ache just to hear it. He turned toward her voice, and I watched something extraordinary happen. For just a moment, his confused, wary expression cleared. Something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition exactly, but connection, like part of him knew her even if his mind couldn't remember how. "Do you know me?" he asked, and there was such desperate hope in his voice that I felt tears sting my eyes. Sarah's hand covered her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. She nodded, unable to speak. I think I might love you," he said, so quietly that only those of us closest could hear. "I don't know why I think that. I don't know you. But looking at you, I feel..." He trailed off, but Sarah understood. She'd always understood him better than anyone. "I loved you too," she whispered. "I still do." What followed was chaos, pure and simple. Word spread through Millfield faster than wildfire. By noon, every person in town knew that Ethan Crawford was back. By evening, the news crews had arrived. By the next morning, our quiet little town was once again the center of a media storm. But in those first few hours, before the world intruded, there was just Ethan and Sarah and the impossible task of trying to bridge 10 years of separation and loss. Murphy, bless him, shuttled them into his office behind the kitchen, away from the staring crowd and the phones that had already started ringing. I managed to convince him to let me stay, partly because I was the press, but mostly because I'd been there when it all began, and somehow that felt important. Watching them together was like watching someone try to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Sarah would tell him something about their past, their first date, their junior prom, the promise ring he'd given her for her 17th birthday, and Ethan would listen with the desperate intensity of someone trying to remember how to breathe. "We were going to go to state together," Sarah said, her voice careful and controlled. "You had a football scholarship. I was going to study education. We had it all planned out." Ethan nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. "I wish I could remember. I want to remember, but it's like trying to see through something, but then it's gone." "What do you remember?" Sarah asked gently. "Anything at all?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. Fragments, images that might be dreams or might be memories. The smell of apple pie, the sound of rain on a roof, a woman's voice singing. He looked at Sarah hopefully. "Did you sing?" She smiled through her tears. Sometimes. You always said I had a terrible voice, but you liked it anyway." "I remember a car," he said suddenly. "Silver and water, cold water." He touched his scar. Pain. Sarah reached across the small space between them and took his hand. "You don't have to remember everything at once. We have time." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. Did they have time? Where had he been for 10 years? Why couldn't he remember? And perhaps most importantly, what had given him that terrible scar? The FBI arrived before any of us were ready for them. Agent Morrison, who'd led the original investigation, came out of retirement to interview Ethan. Dr. Phillips, the town's only psychiatrist, was called in to evaluate his mental state. Medical experts were consulted about his amnesia. Through it all, Ethan submitted to every test, every interview, every examination with a patience that seemed almost superhuman. He answered the same questions over and over. Where had he been? What was the last thing he remembered? How had he gotten his injuries? But his answers never varied. His last clear memory was from sometime during his senior year of high school. Everything after that was a blank until he'd woken up in a homeless shelter in Portland 6 months earlier, confused and disoriented, with no idea who he was or how he'd gotten there. The doctors there said I'd been brought in after some kind of altercation, he explained to Agent Morrison during one of their sessions. "Someone found me unconscious in an alley. I had severe head trauma, infected wounds, signs of prolonged malnutrition. They thought I might die." "But you recovered," Morrison said. "Physically, yes. But the memories. They said the damage might be permanent, that I might never remember what happened to me. Dr. Phillips confirmed that trauma-induced amnesia was real and that head injuries could certainly cause the kind of memory loss Ethan was experiencing. The scans they ran showed clear evidence of old trauma to his brain, consistent with a severe blow to the head. But knowing the medical facts didn't make the situation any less surreal. Ethan Crawford, the boy who'd vanished without a trace, was back, older, scarred, broken in ways that went beyond the physical, but back. The town's reaction was mixed, and that's putting it kindly. Some people welcomed him back with open arms, treating his return like a miracle. They organized meal trains, offered him places to stay, donated clothes and money to help him get back on his feet. But others were suspicious. 10 years was a long time, and Ethan's disappearance had left deep scars on the community. Some people had never recovered from the trauma of losing their golden boy. Others had built new lives around the tragedy, and his return felt like an unwelcome disruption. "It's convenient, isn't it?" I heard Brenda Thompson say at the grocery store, her voice carrying the particular kind of venom that small-town gossips specialize in. "He shows up with no memory of where he's been or what he's done. Very convenient." The conspiracy theories started almost immediately. Some people thought he'd faked his own disappearance and was coming back now for some ulterior motive. Others believed he'd been living under an assumed identity and had gotten into legal trouble that forced him to surface. The internet true crime community had a field day, creating elaborate theories about everything from witness protection to alien abduction. Through it all, Sarah stood by him with a loyalty that was both touching and heartbreaking to witness. She visited him every day at the small apartment the town had provided above Murphy's diner. She brought him books to read, photos to look at, stories about the life he'd forgotten. And slowly, gradually, Ethan began to remember fragments. Not the big things, not the night he disappeared, or the years that followed. Instead, he remembered small moments, the way Sarah's hand felt in his, the taste of victory after winning the state championship, the sound of his father's laugh. "It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle," he explained to me during one of our interviews. "Sometimes I find a piece that fits, and suddenly a small part of the picture becomes clear, but there are still so many missing pieces." I watched him carefully during those early weeks, looking for any sign that he was faking his amnesia or hiding something. But everything about his behavior suggested genuine confusion and loss. He startled easily at loud noises. He seemed overwhelmed by crowds. He moved through the world with the careful uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure what might trigger painful memories. And his feelings for Sarah appeared completely genuine. Watching them together was like watching someone fall in love for the first time. Except that first time had happened years earlier in a different life. He would look at her with such wonder, such gratitude, like he couldn't believe someone so beautiful would care about someone as broken as he was. "I know this is hard for you," he told her one evening when I happened to be at Murphy's. "Having me back, but not really back. I'm not the person you loved. I don't even know who that person was." Sarah took his hands in hers, her eyes fierce with determination. "You're still you, Ethan. The important parts of you, the kindness, the gentleness, the way you care about other people, that's all still there. The rest we can figure out together." I believed her. More importantly, I believed him. Whatever had happened to Ethan Crawford in those lost 10 years, whatever had given him that scar and stolen his memories, he seemed like a man genuinely trying to rebuild his life from nothing. That belief would cost me everything. Marcus Delacroix arrived in Millfield on a Thursday afternoon in November, exactly 6 weeks after Ethan's return. I was working late at the Gazette office, trying to finish a story about the upcoming holiday parade, when he walked in without knocking. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a way that screamed expensive lawyer or federal agent. Dark hair, sharp eyes, and a smile that never reached past his lips. Everything about him radiated controlled menace, like a predator who'd learned to wear human clothing. "I'm looking for information about Ethan Crawford," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from my desk like he owned it. I'd been dealing with reporters and curiosity seekers for weeks, so this wasn't unusual. But something about this man immediately put me on edge. "Are you a journalist?" I asked. His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "You could say that. I'm Marcus Delacroix. I run a private investigation firm in Seattle." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I have some information about Mr. Crawford that I think you might find interesting." He slid the folder across my desk, and I opened it with the same sick feeling you get when you know you're about to see something you can't unsee. Inside were photographs. Security camera stills, grainy but clear enough to make out the faces. And in every single one, there was Ethan Crawford, but not the gentle, confused man who'd been shelving books at our library. This Ethan was different, harder. The photos showed him in what looked like an underground fighting ring, his face twisted with violence, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages as he stood over a fallen opponent. The timestamps on the photos were from less than 2 years ago. "These were taken in Portland," Delacroix said conversationally, as if he wasn't dropping a bomb that would destroy everything. "Your golden boy wasn't exactly wandering around in a haze of amnesia. He was making quite a name for himself in some very unsavory circles." I stared at the photos, my mind struggling to reconcile the man in these images with the broken, gentle soul I'd been watching try to rebuild his life. This man looked capable of extreme violence, his eyes cold and calculating as he circled his opponent like a predator playing with prey. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "Justice," Delacroix said simply. "You see, 2 years ago, someone matching your friend's description killed my brother in one of those underground fights, beat him to death with his bare hands, and then disappeared into the night. I've been tracking him ever since." The words hit me like physical blows. That's impossible. Ethan wouldn't what? Wouldn't lie? Wouldn't fake amnesia to escape the consequences of his actions? Delacroix's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the raw grief and rage underneath. "My brother Antoine was 28 years old. He had a wife, 2 small children. He died because your golden boy couldn't control his temper." He stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "I'll be in town for a few more days. I suggest you warn Mr. Crawford that his past is catching up with him, because if he doesn't turn himself in voluntarily, I'll make sure the truth comes out in a much less pleasant way." After he left, and I sat alone in my office, staring at those photographs until my eyes watered. Was it possible? Could Ethan really be faking his amnesia? Could the gentle, broken man I'd been watching rebuild his life actually be a killer? I thought about all the times I'd seen him startle at sudden noises, the way he moved through the world like he was afraid of his own shadow. I'd attributed it to trauma, to whatever had caused his memory loss. But what if it was guilt? What if it was the hypervigilance of someone who knew he was being hunted? The photographs didn't lie. The man in those images was Ethan Crawford, and he looked nothing like a confused amnesia victim. He looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and who was very, very good at hurting people. I spent the next 3 days in agony, torn between my duty as a journalist and my growing affection for the man Ethan seemed to have become. I watched him at the library, helping elderly patrons find books. His patience infinite and his kindness genuine. I saw him with Sarah, the way his face lit up when she walked into a room, the careful tenderness with which he touched her hand. And if he was acting, he was the most accomplished performer I'd ever encountered. But the evidence was damning. I did my own research, digging into public records from Portland. What I found made my blood run cold. Ethan had been arrested multiple times over the past few years. Assault, disturbing the peace, public intoxication. The charges had always been dropped or pled down, but the pattern was clear. This wasn't a man who'd been living as a confused amnesia victim. This was someone with a serious anger problem and a history of violence. I found hospital records too. Multiple admissions for injuries consistent with fighting, broken ribs, fractured jaw, severe lacerations, the kind of damage you'd expect from underground boxing matches. But it was the witness statement from his last arrest that really shook me. A bartender had called police after Ethan had beaten another patron so severely that the man had required multiple surgeries. The description of the attack was brutal, methodical, not a bar fight that got out of hand, but a calculated beating delivered by someone who knew exactly how to inflict maximum damage. The victim's name was Antoine Delacroix. I couldn't sleep that night, and I kept thinking about Sarah, about how happy she'd been since Ethan's return. She was glowing with joy in a way I hadn't seen since before his disappearance. She'd gotten her fairy tale ending back. Her lost love returned to her. How could I possibly be the one to destroy that? But I also thought about Antoine Delacroix's wife and children, about Marcus Delacroix's grief-filled eyes. If Ethan really had killed that man, if he was really faking his amnesia to escape justice, then keeping his secret made me complicit in whatever he might do next. I made my decision on a Saturday morning. I would confront Ethan directly, give him a chance to explain before I took Delacroix's evidence to the authorities. I found him at the library, alone except for old Mr. Garrison, who was dozing over a newspaper in the corner. Ethan was at the reference desk, reading what looked like a medical textbook with the same intense focus he brought to everything. "Hey, Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Got a minute?" He looked up with that gentle smile that had become so familiar. "Of course. What can I help you with?" I sat down across from him, studying his face for any sign of deception. "I wanted to ask you about Portland, about your time there before you came back." The change in his expression was subtle but immediate. The smile didn't disappear, but it became more careful, more guarded. "Portland," he repeated. "You said you woke up in a homeless shelter there 6 months ago. That was the first thing you remembered. That's right. His voice was steady, but his hand had moved unconsciously to touch his scar. A gesture I'd learned was his tell when he was anxious. What do you remember about your time there, before you came back? He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. Not much. Fragments, mostly. I know I was hurt, confused. The people at the shelter said I'd been brought in after a fight. Someone had beaten me pretty badly. He gestured to his scar. This was infected when I arrived. They thought I might die. A fight? I pressed. What kind of fight? Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe? Or fear? I don't know. I can't remember. The doctors said the head trauma was severe enough to cause permanent memory damage. He sounded so sincere, so genuinely confused and hurt. But I thought about those police reports, about the systematic way he'd apparently beaten Marcus Delacroix's brother. Ethan, I said carefully, have you remembered anything else? Anything you haven't told the FBI? The silence stretched between us, and for a moment I thought he might confess everything. But then he shook his head. I wish there was more. I wish I could remember what happened to me, where I've been all these years, the not knowing. It's the worst part, feeling like half of yourself is missing. I wanted to believe him. Everything about his manner, his voice, his expression suggested genuine anguish. But I couldn't shake the image of those security camera photos, the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd fought. The FBI is looking into your time in Portland, I said, watching his reaction, trying to piece together your movements. I know. Agent Morrison told me. I've given them everything I can remember, which isn't much. He looked at me with those sad, confused eyes. Do you think they'll find something? Something that might help me remember? Either he was the most accomplished liar I'd ever met, or he was genuinely the victim of traumatic amnesia, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. That night, I made the call that would change everything. Agent Morrison, I need to show you something about Ethan Crawford. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, away from prying eyes and gossiping tongues. Morrison looked older than I remembered, the stress of the Crawford case having aged him in the years since the initial investigation. I handed him Delacroix's folder, along with the additional research I'd done. Morrison studied everything in grim silence, his expression growing darker with each page. Where did you get these? He asked finally. I told him about Delacroix's visit, about the allegations concerning his brother's death. Morrison listened without interruption, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. This changes everything, he said when I finished. If even half of this is true. You think he's faking the amnesia? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Trauma-induced amnesia is real, and the head injury documented in these medical records is certainly severe enough to cause memory loss. But the timing is convenient. And these photographs. And he tapped the security camera stills. This doesn't look like a man suffering from confused trauma. This looks like someone who knows exactly what he's doing. So what happens now? Now I reopen the investigation properly. And if Ethan Crawford is connected to a murder in Portland, if he's been living under an assumed identity while committing violent crimes. He shook his head. Let's just say his memory problems are about to become the least of his concerns. I left that meeting with a heavy heart, knowing I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Within days, the truth would come out, and Ethan's carefully constructed new life would crumble. But I wasn't prepared for how it would actually happen. I wasn't prepared for the devastation that would follow. The truth came out on a Wednesday morning, and it came out in the worst possible way. I was at the Gazette office when my phone rang. It was Sarah, and she was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "They arrested him," she cried. "The FBI came to the library and arrested Ethan. They're saying he killed someone. They're saying he's been lying about everything." My heart sank like a stone. "Sarah, it was you, wasn't it?" Her voice was thick with betrayal and rage. "You've been asking questions, digging into his past. You did this. I shan't." I couldn't deny it. I couldn't even defend it. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I had to." She hung up on me. Within hours, the story had exploded nationwide. The golden boy who'd returned with no memory was actually a suspected killer. The fairy tale reunion was revealed as an elaborate deception. The town that had welcomed him back with open arms felt betrayed, manipulated, fooled. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Sarah's world collapse all over again. I found her at the courthouse the morning of Ethan's bail hearing, holding a sign that read, "Innocent until proven guilty," in shaky handwriting. She looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, her face gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her hands trembling as she held her protest sign. "Sarah," I said gently, approaching her like I might approach a wounded animal, "maybe you should go home. Let his lawyers handle this." She turned to me with eyes full of such pain and fury that I took a step back. "He didn't do this," she said, her voice raw. "I know he didn't. How can you be so sure?" "Because I know him," she exploded. "Because I've watched him flinch away from violence, seen him go out of his way to avoid conflict. Because the man they're describing isn't the man I've been falling in love with all over again." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt creeping in. The same doubt that was eating at everyone who'd believed in Ethan Crawford's redemption story. The bail hearing was a circus. Media from across the country descended on our small courthouse, turning the proceedings into a spectacle. Ethan sat at the defendant's table looking lost and confused, like he couldn't understand how he'd ended up there. His lawyer, a public defender named Janet Mills, did her best with an impossible case. She argued that her client's amnesia was real, documented by multiple medical professionals. She pointed out that the evidence linking him to Antoine Delacroix's death was circumstantial. She emphasized that he'd voluntarily returned to a town where he could easily be found, hardly the behavior of a man fleeing justice. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They described a calculated killer who'd used multiple identities over the years, who'd been involved in organized underground fighting rings, who'd used violence as a tool to get what he wanted. They argued that his amnesia was a convenient fiction designed to evoke sympathy and avoid accountability. The judge set bail at $2 million. Far more than Ethan or anyone in town could possibly raise. That night, As I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. Had I protected the town from a dangerous man? Or had I destroyed an innocent victim of circumstances beyond his control? The answer came sooner than I expected, and it came from the most unexpected source. I was working late again, trying to process everything that had happened. When Sarah walked into my office, she looked terrible, exhausted, hollow-eyed, like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my heart already racing. "What is it?" She sat down slowly, her hands shaking as she pulled an envelope from her purse. "I've been lying," she said simply. "About Ethan, about his memories, about everything." The world seemed to tilt around me. "What do you mean?" She slid the envelope across my desk. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in Ethan's handwriting. "He's been writing to me for 3 years," she said, her voice breaking. "Ever since he found out where I was. He never lost his memory. He remembered everything from the moment he disappeared." I stared at the letters, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Why didn't you?" "Because I loved him," she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "Because he begged me not to tell anyone. Because he convinced me that he was trying to become a better person, that he deserved a second chance." She pulled out one of the letters with trembling hands and began to read in a voice thick with anguish. "Sarah, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can never make up for what I put you through, what I put everyone through, but I need you to know that leaving wasn't about running away from you, and it was about running away from what I was becoming. I was scared, Sarah, scared of the anger inside me, scared of what I might do to someone I loved." "What was he becoming?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Violent, hungry, control." Sarah's voice was barely audible now. "He said he'd been having episodes, blackouts where he'd lose himself completely." The night of prom. After we left the dance, we went to an after-party. There were some college guys there, drunk and belligerent. They said something crude about me, and Ethan just napped. She paused, struggling to continue. "He beat one of them so badly that the kid ended up in intensive care. Ethan thought he might have killed him, so he ran. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture more tragic than anything I'd imagined. He left his car in the creek to fake his own death." Sarah nodded miserably. "He thought if everyone believed he was dead, no one would look for him. He could start over somewhere else, get help, figure out what was wrong with him. But that's not what happened. No." She laughed bitterly. "It got worse, and so much worse. The anger, the violence, it consumed him. He got involved with underground fighting because it was the only place where his rage felt useful. But instead of helping him, it made him into something monstrous. Like killing Antoine Delacroix." "He doesn't remember that specific fight," Sarah said quietly. "But he doesn't deny it happened. He says there were so many fights, so much violence, that they all blur together. He might have killed him. He might have killed others." I felt sick. "Sarah, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't live with the lie anymore. she said, her voice breaking completely. Because watching him sit in that courtroom, listening to his lawyer argue that he's an innocent victim of amnesia. If he killed that man, if he killed others, then he needs to face the consequences. She stood up on shaky legs, leaving the letters scattered across my desk. But I also need you to understand something. The man who wrote those letters, the man who came back to try to make things right, that's the real Ethan. Not the golden boy everyone remembers. Not the killer everyone's afraid of now. Just a broken man trying to find redemption, the only way he knew how. After she left, I spent hours reading through those letters. They chronicled Ethan's descent into violence and his gradual recognition that he needed help. The later letters showed his attempts at therapy, at anger management, at rebuilding himself into someone worthy of the love he'd thrown away. But they also contained confessions, not to specific crimes, but to a pattern of violence that had escalated far beyond anything anyone in Millfield could have imagined. The gentle but confused man who'd returned to town was real, but so was the killer who'd written these letters. The next morning, I made the hardest phone call of my life. "Agent Morrison, there's something else you need to see." The plea hearing was held on a gray December morning, with snow falling softly outside the courthouse windows. The media attention had died down somewhat, but the courtroom was still packed with townspeople, reporters, and curious onlookers. Ethan's new lawyer, a high-profile defense attorney named David Chen, who'd taken the case pro bono, had negotiated a plea agreement. Ethan would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the death of Antoine Delacroix, acknowledging that while he might not remember the specific incident, he couldn't deny his involvement in the underground fighting scene or his pattern of escalating violence. In exchange, he would receive a sentence of 15 years with the possibility of parole in 10. When Judge Harrison asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Ethan stood slowly. The orange jumpsuit made him look younger somehow, more vulnerable. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not as the man I was 10 years ago, and not as the man I became in the years I was lost. I stand here as someone who's finally ready to take responsibility for the damage I've caused." He turned to face the courtroom, his eyes finding Sarah's in the gallery before moving to Marcus Delacroix, who sat in the front row with his sister-in-law and her children. "I can't remember killing your brother, Mr. Delacroix, but I can't deny it either. I became someone capable of that kind of violence, someone who used fighting as an outlet for anger and pain I didn't know how to handle. And if I killed Antoine, then I'm responsible for that, regardless of what I can or can't remember." His voice caught slightly as he continued. "To the people of Millfield, I want you to know that coming home wasn't about escaping justice. It was about trying to find the person I used to be, the person I thought I could become again. That was selfish of me. I should have turned myself in years ago." He looked at Sarah again, and his composure finally cracked. "And to Sarah, I want you to know that loving you again, being loved by you again, reminded me what it felt like to be human. I'm sorry I can't be the man you deserved. I'm sorry I never was." Judge Harrison sentenced him to the agreed-upon 15 years. As he was led away in shackles, Ethan's eyes met mine across the courtroom. There was no anger there, no resentment for my role in bringing his past to light. Most just a sad acknowledgement that some stories don't have happy endings. Sarah left town 3 days later. I helped her load her car, watching as she packed away the remnants of a life that had been built around waiting for someone who could never really come home. She'd taken a job with a literacy nonprofit in Denver, a fresh start far from the ghosts that haunted Millfield. "Do you think he really changed?" I asked as she folded clothes into boxes. "Do you think he was genuinely trying to become someone better?" She was quiet for a long moment, wrapping a framed photo of her and Ethan from high school in bubble wrap. "I think people can change," she said finally. "I think Ethan was genuinely trying to become someone better, but I also think some damage can't be undone. Some bridges can't be rebuilt." She looked up at me with eyes that held a lifetime of sadness. "The hardest part isn't losing him again. The hardest part is realizing that maybe I never really knew him at all. Not the boy I fell in love with, not the man who came back. Maybe the person I loved was always just a reflection of who I wanted him to be." The last thing she said to me before driving away was this: "Love isn't enough. You know, I thought it was, but it's not. Sometimes love just makes you complicit in someone else's destruction." 6 months later, I received my first letter from Ethan. It arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he'd walked back into our lives. The return address was from Millbrook Correctional Facility, about 3 hours north of Millfield. I almost threw it away unopened. I'd moved on, or at least I was trying to. I'd taken a job with a larger paper in the state capital, covering real investigative journalism instead of small-town gossip. I was trying to rebuild my reputation after the Crawford affair, trying to prove that I was more than just the reporter who'd brought down the golden boy. But something made me open the letter. It was short, written in the same careful handwriting I remembered from his letters to Sarah. "Dear Alex, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why, but I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know that sounds strange, considering that your investigation is the reason I'm here. But you gave me something I couldn't give myself: accountability. For years, I convinced myself that I was the victim of my own anger, that the violence was something that happened to me rather than something I chose. Coming back to Millfield, pretending to have amnesia, letting everyone believe I was just a broken man trying to heal, it was the ultimate act of selfishness. I was asking people to love the man I wanted to be while hiding the man I actually was. You forced me to face the truth. You made it impossible for me to keep lying to myself and everyone else. And for that, I'm grateful. I know this doesn't bring back Antoine Delacroix. I know it doesn't repair the damage I did to Sarah, to my family, to the entire town. But maybe it's a start. I'm getting help here. Real help. Not the kind of surface therapy I tried before. I'm learning to understand my anger, to take responsibility for my choices instead of blaming them on impulses I couldn't control. I may never remember everything I did during those lost years, but I'm learning to accept responsibility for all of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your choice to pursue the truth, even when it was painful, was the right one. Ethan, I kept that letter, and the ones that followed. They came sporadically, every few months, sometimes longer gaps between them. Ethan wrote about his therapy, about the anger management classes he was taking, about his work in the prison library, helping other inmates earn their GEDs. He wrote about his regret, his ongoing efforts to understand what had made him capable of such violence. He wrote about the other inmates he'd met, men who'd made similar choices, who'd let anger consume them until violence became their primary language. He never asked me to write back, and I never did. But I kept the letters, filed away with all the other documentation of his story. They were evidence of something. I wasn't sure what. Redemption, maybe, or at least the attempt at it. The most recent letter arrived last month, almost 2 years after his sentencing. In it, Ethan mentioned something that made my blood run cold. I've been having dreams lately. Not memories exactly, but fragments of something that might be memories. Flashes of that night 10 years ago when everything changed. I think my mind is finally ready to let me remember what really happened. The doctors say this sometimes happens with trauma-induced amnesia. The memories can come back years later, when the mind is finally strong enough to process them. But I'm not sure I want to remember. Some truths are too dangerous to know. There's something else, Alex. Something I never told anyone, not even Sarah. The boy I supposedly beat up at that after party, the incident that made me run, he didn't die. He recovered completely. I checked before I came back to Millfield, Mo. Whatever drove me to disappear that night, it wasn't guilt over nearly killing someone. So what was it? What happened that night that was so terrible I chose to vanish rather than face it? I think I'm about to find out, and I'm terrified. The letter ended there, with no signature, no closing. Just those chilling words hanging in the air like a promise of revelations yet to come. I haven't heard from him since. That brings me to now, to this moment, to this story I'm finally ready to tell. It's been 2 years since Ethan Crawford was sentenced. 2 years since Sarah Martinez left Millfield forever. 2 years since our quiet little town learned that golden boys can fall further than anyone imagines. The official story is closed. Ethan pleaded guilty, accepted responsibility, and is serving his time. Justice was served, or as much justice as is possible when the dead can't be brought back to life. But I can't shake the feeling that the real story hasn't been told yet. Those fragments of memory that Ethan mentioned in his last letter. The truth about what really happened the night he disappeared. I think that's the key to everything. Because here's what I've realized over the past 2 years. We all assumed that Ethan's disappearance and his descent into violence were connected, that one led inevitably to the other. But what if we had it backwards? What if something happened that night? Something so traumatic, so devastating, that it broke him completely? What if the violence came after, as a symptom rather than a cause? I've gone back through all the evidence from that night, all the witness statements and police reports. There are gaps, inconsistencies that were never resolved. People who saw Ethan at the after-party said he seemed agitated, upset about something beyond just the fight with those college boys. Sarah mentioned once that he'd seemed different in the weeks leading up to prom. Distant, moody, like he was carrying some burden he couldn't share. She'd attributed it to stress about graduation, about their future plans. But what if it was something else? What if there was something that night? Some encounter, some revelation, some betrayal that shattered Ethan Crawford so completely that the golden boy ceased to exist? What if the man who came back wasn't faking amnesia about those 10 years, but genuinely couldn't remember, because remembering would mean confronting a truth too terrible to bear? I think about Marcus Delacroix's brother, about the underground fighting rings, about all the violence that followed. What if it all stemmed from that one moment of trauma? What if Ethan became a killer not because he was inherently violent, but because violence became the only way he knew how to silence the pain of whatever happened that night? The more I think about it, the more convinced I become that we only know half the story. The real mystery isn't what Ethan did during those 10 lost years. It's what happened to him in the hours before he disappeared. And if I'm right, if there's more to this story than we know, then somewhere out there is the truth that broke our golden boy so completely that he chose to disappear rather than face it. The question is, do any of us really want to know what that truth is? Last week, I made a decision that I'm probably going to regret. I drove up to Millbrook Correctional Facility to see Ethan. I'd never visited him before. Despite the letters, something had always held me back. Guilt, maybe, or fear of what I might see in his eyes. But his last letter, those fragments of returning memory, wouldn't leave me alone. The visitation room was exactly what you'd expect from a state prison. Harsh fluorescent lighting, metal tables bolted to the floor, guards watching everything with tired, suspicious eyes. I waited for 20 minutes before they brought him in. Prison had changed him. He was thinner, more angular, his face bearing the particular wariness that comes from living in a place where violence is always just beneath the surface. But his eyes were clearer somehow, more present than they'd been during those confused weeks after his return. "Alex," he said, settling into the plastic chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Your last letter," I said. "You mentioned memories coming back. Needed to know." He nodded slowly. "They started about 3 months ago. Just flashes at first, images that might have been dreams, but they're getting clearer, more detailed." He paused, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I remember that night now, the night I disappeared. What happened, Ethan?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so deep it made my chest ache. "You have to understand, Alex. I was 18 years old. I thought I knew everything. Thought I was ready for anything. But some truths can destroy you if you're not prepared for them." "What truth?" He took a shaky breath. "After the fight at the party, Sarah and I went for a drive. We needed to cool down, to talk about what had happened. I was already starting to scare myself with how angry I could get, how easily violence came to me. Sarah was trying to help me process it." He paused, lost in the memory. "We ended up at Miller's Creek, where they found my car later. We were just sitting there, talking, when we saw headlights, another car pulling up to the creek. Who was it? At first, I thought it was just another couple looking for privacy, but then I recognized the car. It belonged to Officer Thompson, Brenda Thompson's husband. You remember? He was a deputy then." I nodded, remembering Rick Thompson. He'd been one of the cops who'd worked Ethan's disappearance case. "He wasn't alone," Ethan continued. "There was someone with him. A kid, maybe 14, 15 years old. At first, I thought maybe it was his son or something. But then, stopped, his face going pale. Then what? Ethan. The kid was crying, begging Thompson to stop, to let him go. And Thompson was... God. Alex, and he was... Ethan's voice broke. He was hurting him, doing things to him that no adult should ever do to a child. The room seemed to spin around me. Jesus. I should have called for help immediately, should have found a way to stop it. But I was just a kid myself, and I froze. Sarah and I just sat there in my car, watching this monster abuse a child, and we did nothing. What happened then? Thompson saw us. Our headlights must have reflected off something, or maybe he heard the engine. He left the kid there and came over to our car. He was a... That's what I remember most clearly, how calm he was. Ethan's hands were shaking now. He explained to us very matter-of-factly that if we ever told anyone what we'd seen, he would destroy us. He knew things. He said, things about my family, about Sarah's family. He could plant evidence, falsify reports, make our lives hell in ways we couldn't even imagine. So you stayed quiet. For 3 weeks, yes, we tried to pretend it never happened, but it was eating me alive. Alex. Every time I saw Thompson around town, every time I heard about some kid going missing or running away, I wondered if we could have prevented it by speaking up. What changed? Sarah did some research. She found out that several boys had disappeared from the area over the past few years. Runaways, mostly. Kids from broken homes who nobody looked for very hard. She thought Thompson might be connected. The pieces were starting to fall into place. So you decided to go to the authorities. We were going to go to the state police the Monday after prom. We had it all planned out. But somehow Thompson found out. Ethan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The night of prom, and after we left the dance, he was waiting for us. At Miller's Creek? No. He pulled us over on the way home, said it was a routine traffic stop. But once we were out of the car, he made it clear that he knew what we were planning. He said he couldn't let us destroy his life, his family. What did he do? He gave us a choice. We could disappear, leave town, start new lives somewhere else, never come back. Or he could arrange for us to have an accident. A very fatal accident. The horror of it was almost too much to process. So you ran. I ran. Sarah wanted to fight, wanted to take our chances with the authorities. But I was so scared. Alex, so fucking scared. Thompson had shown us photos, other kids who'd tried to expose him, kids who'd ended up dead or missing. He wasn't bluffing. What about Sarah? I convinced her that running was the only way to keep her safe. We staged my disappearance, left my car in the creek, made it look like I'd had an accident. Sarah was supposed to wait a few months, then leave town for college and never come back. But she did come back. She came back because she never stopped believing I was alive, never stopped hoping I'd find my way home. And Thompson. He died 5 years ago. Heart attack, well. By the time it was safe for me to return, I was already too broken, too lost in violence and anger to deserve the life I'd left behind. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his revelation settling between us. Finally, I found my voice. Why didn't you tell anyone this before, during your trial? Because Thompson was dead, and his victims were still out there. Because exposing what happened wouldn't bring back Antoine Delacroix or undo any of the damage I'd caused. Because some secrets are too dangerous to tell. But you're telling me now. He nodded slowly. Because I think there are still victims out there who deserve justice. Because Thompson might have had accomplices. People who are still hurting kids. Because the truth has a way of demanding recognition, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. I need you to investigate this, Alex. I need you to find those other victims, to expose what Thompson was doing. I can't undo the violence I've committed, but maybe I can finally do something good with the truth that started it all. I left the prison that day with my head spinning and my heart heavy. Ethan's story explained so much: his disappearance, his descent into violence, the particular kind of trauma that had shaped him into someone capable of killing. But it also opened up a whole new nightmare. If Rick Thompson had been abusing children for years, if he'd had accomplices or a network of enablers, then there were victims out there who'd never gotten justice. There were families who'd never learned the truth about what happened to their children. I spent the next month doing the kind of investigation I'd always dreamed of: real journalism, important work that could actually make a difference. I dug into Thompson's background, his cases, his connections. I tracked down some of the missing boys Sarah had identified all those years ago. What I found was worse than anything I'd imagined. Thompson hadn't been working alone. There was a whole network of men, respected members of the community, pillars of society, who'd been trafficking and abusing children for decades. Thompson had been their muscle, their enforcer, the one who made sure nobody talked. The boys they'd targeted were always vulnerable: runaways, kids from broken homes, children with no one to advocate for them. When these boys tried to speak up, Thompson would make them disappear. Mom. Sometimes permanently. Mom. I found 3 survivors willing to talk. Men now, but still bearing the scars of what had been done to them as children. Their stories were heartbreaking, harrowing, and consistent. Thompson and his associates had operated with impunity for years, protected by badges and social status and the complicity of a system that didn't want to see. The story I wrote won awards, led to arrests, brought justice to families who'd been searching for answers for decades. But it also destroyed lives, including those of innocent family members who'd had no idea what their fathers, husbands, and brothers had been doing. Brenda Thompson, Rick's widow, never spoke to me again after the story broke. She moved away from Millfield within a month, unable to bear the weight of the revelations about her husband. Their children changed their names, tried to disappear into anonymity. I felt for them. They were victims too, in their way. But I also thought about all the children who'd suffered in silence, all the families who'd never known what happened to their sons. The truth was more important than anyone's comfort, even mine. The story of Ethan Crawford and Rick Thompson made national news. The golden boy who'd vanished after prom had actually been a witness to abuse, a young man who'd tried to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price for it. His descent into violence was reframed as the tragic consequence of trauma, the inevitable result of carrying unbearable secrets for too long. There was talk of overturning his conviction, of commuting his sentence in light of the new revelations. Victim advocacy groups rallied to his cause. Legal experts debated whether someone could be held fully responsible for crimes committed while suffering from severe PTSD. But Ethan himself rejected all attempts to reduce his sentence or overturn his conviction. "I killed a man," he said in a statement read by his lawyer. "Regardless of the circumstances that led me to that point, regardless of the trauma I'd experienced, I chose violence over seeking help. I chose to hurt others rather than heal myself." Antoine Delacroix is dead because of choices I made, and I need to face the consequences of those choices. It was a remarkable act of accountability from someone who'd spent years running from responsibility. The broken boy who'd fled Millfield in terror had become a man willing to own his mistakes, even when the world was offering him excuses. Sarah came back for the press conference where the full story was revealed. I saw her in the back of the room, tears streaming down her face as the details of that night 10 years ago were finally made public. Afterward, she approached me outside the courthouse. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding the truth, for giving meaning to all of this suffering." "I'm sorry," I replied, "for everything you went through, for not believing in him when he needed it most." She shook her head. "We were kids, Alex. We didn't know how to handle something like this. We did the best we could with the information we had." "Do you forgive him? For the lies? For coming back and pretending to have amnesia?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I understand him now in a way I never did before. I understand why he ran, why he couldn't face the truth, why he became someone capable of violence. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving." "Or will you visit him?" "I don't know. Maybe someday, when I'm ready to face what we lost, what we might have been if things had been different." She paused, looking up at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, albeit too late for so many. "But right now, I need to learn how to live with the truth." She left Millfield again that afternoon, returning to her new life in Denver. But before she went, she did one last thing. She visited Margaret Crawford, Ethan's mother, who'd moved back to town after the truth came out. I don't know what they said to each other. Those two women who'd loved Ethan in different ways and lost him to circumstances beyond their control. But I like to think they found some measure of peace in sharing their grief, in acknowledging the complexity of loving someone who'd been both victim and perpetrator, both hero and villain. Ethan serves his sentence quietly, working in the prison library, helping other inmates earn their GEDs, attending therapy and anger management classes. He's become something of a mentor to younger prisoners, men who remind him of his own 18-year-old self, angry, confused, making choices that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. He still writes to me occasionally. The letters are different now, less focused on his own pain and more concerned with the bigger picture. He writes about the kids he's helping in prison, about the programs he's developing to address trauma and anger before they lead to violence. In his most recent letter, he mentioned that he's been working with victim advocacy groups to develop educational materials about the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse. He wants to help other survivors understand that trauma can manifest in unexpected ways, that violence is sometimes a symptom of deeper wounds that need healing. I can't undo what I did," he wrote. "I can't bring back Antoine Delacroix or repair all the damage I've caused, but maybe I can help other people recognize the signs, get help before they make the choices I made. Maybe some good can come from all of this suffering." He'll be eligible for parole in 8 more years. I don't know if he'll get it. The parole board doesn't always look favorably on violent offenders, regardless of the circumstances. But if he does get out, I think he'll be a different man than the one who disappeared all those years ago. Not the golden boy everyone remembered. That innocence can never be recovered. Not the killer he became. That violence has been acknowledged and addressed. But something new. A man who understands both the capacity for good and evil that exists in all of us, who's learned to choose accountability over excuses, healing over anger. Millfield has changed since the truth came out. The revelation that respected members of the community had been involved in child trafficking shattered a lot of illusions, forced uncomfortable conversations about trust and power and the ways that evil can hide behind friendly faces. Some people left town, unable to reconcile the place they'd loved with the horrors that had been happening in secret for so long. Others stayed and worked to rebuild, to create systems and safeguards that might prevent future abuse. The elementary school where Sarah used to teach has new policies about background checks and supervision. The police department has been restructured, with outside oversight and regular training on recognizing and reporting abuse. Victim advocacy groups have established a presence in the community, making sure that vulnerable children have someone to turn to. It's not perfect. No place ever is. But it's honest in a way it wasn't before. The pretty facade has been stripped away, revealing both the ugliness underneath and the possibility for genuine healing. I still live here, still work for the Gazette, though I've expanded into freelance investigative work for larger papers. The Crawford story opened doors for me professionally, but more importantly, it taught me about the weight of truth-telling, about the responsibility that comes with having the power to expose secrets. I think about Ethan often, about the 18-year-old boy who witnessed something terrible and made a choice that changed the trajectory of his entire life. I wonder what would have happened if he'd been braver, if he'd gone to the authorities despite Thompson's threats. How many children might have been saved? How different might his own life have been? But I also recognize that he was just a kid, scared and unprepared for the evil he'd encountered. The real villains in this story are the adults who exploited children and the systems that failed to protect them. Ethan was as much a victim as anyone else. It just took him longer to find his way to healing. There's one more thing I need to tell you. One final piece of this story that I've been reluctant to share. 3 months ago, I received a letter that wasn't from Ethan. It was from a woman named Maria Santos, a social worker in Phoenix who'd been following the coverage of the Crawford case. She wrote to tell me about a client of hers, a young man named David who'd aged out of the foster care system and was struggling with anger issues and violent outbursts. David had been one of the boys who disappeared from the Millfield area 15 years ago, when he was 13. He'd managed to escape from his captors after several months of abuse, but he'd been too traumatized and scared to tell anyone what had happened. Instead, he'd lived on the streets, moving from city to city, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments or trust anyone. The abuse had shaped him in much the same way it had shaped Ethan, turning him into someone who used violence as a language, who saw the world as a dangerous place where only the strong survived. But unlike Ethan, David had found help before he killed anyone. Maria had connected him with trauma-informed therapy, with support groups for male survivors of sexual abuse, with programs that addressed the root causes of his anger rather than just trying to wash its symptoms. "I wanted you to know," Maria wrote, "that your story about Ethan Crawford probably saved my client's life." When David read about how childhood trauma had shaped Ethan's choices, how violence had become his way of coping with unbearable pain, he finally understood that he wasn't alone. He wasn't a monster. He was a survivor who needed help. She included a letter from David himself, a remarkable document that showed both the depth of his trauma and the strength of his healing journey. He wrote about his own anger, his own capacity for violence, and his determination not to let his past turn him into someone he couldn't live with. "Ethan Crawford could have been me," David wrote. "If I hadn't found the right help at the right time, I could have ended up in prison for hurting someone. His story showed me that trauma doesn't have to define us, that we can choose healing over revenge, accountability over victimhood." David is doing well now. According to Maria, he's working as a peer counselor for other male survivors, helping them understand that their anger and pain are valid, but that violence doesn't have to be inevitable. He's living proof that the cycle can be broken, that even the most damaged people can find their way to wholeness. So that's the story, all of it, as far as I know it. The golden boy who vanished after prom, the witness who became a killer, the community that learned that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces. It's a story about trauma and healing, about the choices we make when we're too young to understand their consequences, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. I've told this story because I believe in the power of truth, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. The comfortable lies we tell ourselves about good and evil, about the people we trust, about the nature of justice, those lies protect us, but they also blind us to the realities that vulnerable people face every day. Ethan Crawford's story is tragic, but it's not unique. There are other golden boys carrying unbearable secrets, other young people being shaped by trauma they're not equipped to process, other victims suffering in silence while their abusers hide behind respectability and social status. If telling this story helps even one person recognize the signs of abuse, get help for trauma, or find the courage to speak truth to power, then all the pain and controversy will have been worth it. Because in the end, that's what justice really looks like. Not just punishment for the guilty, but protection for the innocent, healing for the wounded, and the kind of truth-telling that makes real change possible. The boy who vanished after prom is still serving his sentence, but he's no longer lost. He's found a way to transform his own suffering into something that might help others avoid the same fate. And maybe that's the most important kind of redemption. Not the fairy tale kind, where everything goes back to the way it was, but the kind where brokenness becomes the foundation for building something better. 10 years later, Ethan Crawford came home not as the golden boy everyone remembered, but as something more complex and ultimately more valuable. A man who understood the full weight of his choices and was determined to use that understanding to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Sometimes the best thing a fallen hero can do is light the way for others who are walking the same dark path. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't hiding from your past, but facing it fully and using it to change the future. That's the real story of Ethan Crawford. Not the boy who had everything and lost it all, but the man who found meaning in his mistakes and chose to transform his tragedy into a force for good. And maybe, in the end, that's worth more than any championship ring or homecoming crown could ever be.